Okay, so we are also going live on YouTube, so don't worry about if it says it's live streaming, don't worry about it. Okay. Sorry. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen, yes.
Sure.
Indrani, can you please unmute yourself so that everybody can hear the audio as well? Indrani, can you please unmute yourself so people can hear the audio?
Bharat, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thank you for joining. We have hopefully a wonderful 90 minutes ahead for all of us. And we have a wonderful set of panelists with us today. Welcome to the discussion, so aptly titled Partnering with Empathy and Respect. What does it mean for social enterprises and corporates to partner? My only request is please do mute yourselves unless you would like to ask a question and it's your turn, so that it doesn't affect the flow of the conversations with everybody else. In today's 90 minutes, in order to ensure that it's quick, smooth, we have decided to forego a round of introductions that is usually done, which tends to take about 25 minutes most of the times. So we shall jump into our session directly. All of us have met a bunch of times already in the past in order to prepare for all of you. A few thumb rules that we said we will use today is we will be honest with you. We will not be always nice to each other. We will talk about the problems as they are, and we will talk about how these problems can be addressed. It's just not just talking about the issues, but also talking about how we've been able to successfully work with each other and what are pathways forward. So largely, those are the ground rules that we've set for ourselves. And the idea is that it is going to be interactive. So please do put in your questions as and when you have a question in the chat. In case there is time right then and there, I will request the panelists to answer them right then and there. Otherwise, I will make sure that they are answered by the next panelist immediately. And the idea for today was, I think when Sanyukta involved all of us in the conversation, the idea was today was generally when it comes to corporates and social enterprises, most people think of a singular form of engagement, right? In the form of CSR being the only mode of engagement. For us, as people in the field, as corporates, as social enterprises, that's not generally the case. That's not always the case, right? What are these other models of engagement and how do we get them? And more often than not, you hear challenges about the power dynamic, the funder and the grantee sort of a dynamic. You hear challenges about not understanding ground realities, or you hear challenges about, I mean, it's a simple thing. Why don't you follow paperwork, right? It's a very, very elementary thing. Just follow paperwork. So very elementary challenges like these get discussed when we talk about such relationships and engagements. But then how do you address them? Why do these challenges emerge? We always have blinkers. Blinkers are great sometimes, but not always. So how do we shed those blinkers? And ultimately, all of us are working towards the same goal. What does it mean when we work towards the same goal in order to be able to successfully address the problems that are outside of our engagement problems, right? That are outside of our realities of somebody not answering the phone call in order to make the correct reporting document go to the correct funder at the right time, right? So because the problems are bigger than us, the problems are bigger than our organizations. How do we work collectively to address these problems is the challenge. And I think one of the nice, if I may say so, the silver linings of COVID is the trust that both sides, so to speak, have established with each other. It's not new. It just reinforced the trust that both sides have with each other to be able to address what was happening on the ground. And this is something that is going to be a recurring theme in our conversation. How do you have mutual respect for each other, and how do we work and build towards the end goals together? What we would like to focus on at the very end is also to talk about pathways forward, as I mentioned. How do we move from whatever we've discussed as ground zero? What are our next steps? How can we get there? And to that end, we have, as I said, a wonderful set of panelists. We have Shama, we have Sagarika, we have Anupam, we have Anshu. And we will have potentially Ashwini joining us a little while later. Apologies for that, but hopefully he'll be able to join us as well. Unfortunately or fortunately for us, I think in the time of Zoom, all of us are not really upset when one of us is late, because all of us understand that there is a challenge that we need to deal with, which is why we are late. So that's something that we deal with. Without much ado, Shama, I request you to take the stage. 3 quick questions for you. The first one is largely around, I think, given the diversity and the breadth of the work that you do, and with the collective network that you do, how does it, because there is a lot of angst, there are a lot of on the ground challenges. How do you balance that angst and challenges with respect to such an engagement? And what are those key elements that you look for when you're engaging with a corporate partner? That's the second question. And the third one is, why is it that people think this engagement is only always CSR and nothing outside of CSR? So those are the 3 quick ones for you, Shama. The floor is all yours. All participants have 10 minutes for the first round. We will come back again for all the panelists. Shama, you're on mute. Can you unmute yourself now?
Yes, now that the host has given me that access, I am able to unmute. I don't know if I have all the answers, but let me start. I think when it comes to maybe the last question first, right? I think most of the time we are looking at funding, and that's why we look at CSR, because at least in India, and I think globally also that's true, corporates are engaging in the social impact space via funds. And unfortunately, I think that is a myopic view to the partnership. It's the easiest, so perhaps that's where a bulk of the attention goes. But I think what we should look at is how do we actually engage, right? And I think that is what this whole panel is about. My other panelists will speak to this as well, but is to actually spend time in understanding who we want to engage with. Just like social innovators are not of the same type, social entrepreneurs are not all the same, not all corporates are the same either, right? There's a whole variety of them. I think who do we want to engage with and for what purpose? And how do we actually add value to the corporates and vice versa, right? And the value addition can really be two ways. I think if we are able to start there, and be clear that not everybody is going to be able to engage with everyone, but you will find connects. There is a value alignment, there is a thinking alignment, there's a cause alignment, there is investments that people are willing to make, and that is where the relationship will build, right? But I think we have to start there and build with that. And I think that to me at least is the reason where we have been successful. We've not always been, but where we have been successful is because of that. Right? I don't know if I answered your two questions, but back to you.
Bharat, you have to unmute yourself. All of the panelists, please, you have to unmute.
Okay, thank you, Indrani. Shama, just another question is, given the kind of networks that you work with as well, what are the specific challenges that they face, especially in their engagement with corporates? And how do they overcome these kind of challenges on the ground when they work with corporates specifically? You're on mute now, Shama. I think today's theme for today is we are on mute. Let me try again. Let's try again.
Yes. So sorry, I think the host has to enable that. Otherwise, I'm not able to unmute how much ever I try. Right. I think there definitely are challenges, right? I think what happens, and I'm going to say this, there is not always a lot of trust, right? Or I should say there is trust in pockets. It's not uniform across. And so whether corporates are trying to engage with entrepreneurs or innovators are trying to engage with corporates, I think coming to the same ground takes time. And sometimes we don't have that time, right? If I have to spend 6 months engaging, understanding your work, you have to do it that way. And then we figure out, and there may not be funding at all at the end of that. It's something that we have to actually make peace with. Right? But not everybody is in a position to start there. And I think we actually have to see where that traction is. We work with very small community-led organizations. And sometimes corporates will tell us that we will work with you, but we can't really work with the smaller organizations, right? And so we actually then have to figure out a way of doing that. And sometimes it's worked, sometimes it's not worked. We have organizations, especially in India, if you're talking about local funds, and when it comes to funding, it is a big advantage to actually be able to work with local funds and work with smaller organizations, because we have regulatory environment that doesn't allow for foreign funds to move like that. But it does take that time and effort to build perspective, or to get to a common understanding and be willing to work in networks and consortium. I think the one-to-one is a little bit easier, even despite all the challenges. But when you're talking about the smaller organizations or the smaller innovators who are just getting started, etc., that trust building and creating a network and actually having somebody else guarantee. Sometimes I'm standing and saying, I worked with them for 10 years. I'm backstopping them. Yes, you can work with them. And we actually have to do that.
And Shama, you sort of touched upon a very important point in terms of engaging with different kinds of corporates, right? What has your experience been when you work with corporates largely within the Indian geography versus corporates from outside of this context? Are the challenges fairly different? What are these differences in the kind of problems that you face? Yeah, just a request to all the panelists, please don't mute yourself. I think there's some Zoom thing going on where you mute yourself every time you have to request to unmute.
Yeah, no, thank you everyone for your patience. See, I think the piece, whether it's Indian or a corporate donor or a sort of a foreign or a more global corporate donor, I think that relationship building is required across the board. Right, that spending time trying to get to understand is definitely there in both contexts. So the time and energy is definitely to be spent. I think the only difference perhaps is with the global donor is that they are also exposed to a variety of different other contexts and what's happening and not happening. So they understand some of the challenges a little bit more versus those who are only working in India and looking at only the Indian regulatory requirements or the Indian way of working. There is a difference in style. So sometimes I feel like, and I'm not sure if that's necessarily the right word, but there is maybe perhaps a slightly bit more experimental and a risk-taking willingness when they're a little bit more globally exposed versus that when they are only looking at where the work with the corporate is only limited to India, right? But otherwise, I think the effort, the engagement that needs to go in, time that needs to be spent on both sides, and the opportunities are there. I mean, otherwise, that is common, I think.
Mm-hmm. Thanks a ton, Shama. That sort of opens the door for me to bring in Sagarika, actually. Sagarika, I think the point that Shama made is also, it's not the same brush, right? People tend to generally use the same brush. All CSRs are the same, all social enterprises are the same. I think in this room, we already have a bunch of faces that don't necessarily look like they are the same, right? So, and on that note, a question for you, Sagarika, given your background, given your work, I think one of the challenges, especially I think a couple of participants have already asked about, why is there a trust deficit? Shama spoke about this. It's a long-term process to build this trust, to be able to do it. And you had also, Sagarika, if you could please elaborate on during COVID, how you put aside certain standard practices and then you went ahead without such standard practices because of the nature of the situation. So if you talk about where the trust deficit stems from and how do you address them, and as a organization working in such a large, diverse country like India, what are the specificities that you see in, let's say, rural Raichur versus somewhere in Dantewada? What is the differences in a country like India, right? So from your perspective, right from the norms that you as a corporate have and that you need to follow, the second question is, how does that translate to challenges on the ground? Floor's yours, Sagarika.
Thank you very much, Bharat. And thank you for inviting me. I'm very excited to be here. And actually, more than anything, more than my speaking, I'm looking for us also think through certain sort of beliefs sometimes at once. And then talking about beliefs, I think leads on to the question asked, why is deficit? I think a lot, CSR in the regulated manner in the last decade or so that we've seen is still evolving, right? I mean, and of course the regulations from Ministry of Corporate Affairs don't always help, but it's still nascent. And if you look at many of the companies that started CSR after the regulation came in, for them they were looking at a quick fix, looking at just the law and get things done. It didn't help that there are a lot of notions about the civil society in general. And here I'm not really talking necessarily about social enterprises, but just the large, the entire. Also, how do we define many of these? Social enterprises, do we only mean Section 8 companies, or are you also talking about societies and trusts and organizations under, or sometimes even private limited companies that are working in a sort of for the sector which is sort of related to social, environmental issues in general around the country. So so there's that. Like overall, think about the civil society, it's this large amorphous space, and they don't know how to make head or tail of it. The fact that organizations can be registered under probably more than 50 or over. I don't think I've ever been able to get an exhaustive list of all the laws and acts in the country under which you can register yourself as a civil society player in the country today. So how do you make sense of it, right? I mean, at least when you go to a private limited company, there's only one act under which they're getting registered in the country. You know what to do if you need to sort of take action against them and so on. So, and I know I'm talking about the most extreme sort of conditions, but essentially that is where people come from. They don't understand. Then it doesn't help that the fact that there are all these 3 million plus supposedly organizations in this country. A lot of them have in the past shown to be probably there's been sort of wrongdoing or malpractice and so on that has been proven. It's a different matter in the corporate sector as well, and probably at a much larger scale. But we're talking about the civil society here. So these are some of the contributors to the trust deficit. Also, I think businesses typically when looking at philanthropy, earlier philanthropy, now CSR, which is seen evolving to becoming more core to the business as a whole. It was always seen as something, as a function where we are making money, you're spending money. So even the CSR team itself, when we, sort of early years, we used to get a lot of, oh, you were just here to spend the money and what's the big deal? And, really, what do you do 11 months of the year because you probably get your job done in a month? How difficult can it be to spend money? Now, of course, with all the government and so on, it's a different matter. But so some of these are the notions. I mean, the reason I'm spending a little time on this is just to sort of help understand, help everyone understand where we come from. The trust deficit also has to do with how the funds are spent. I think all of us in the development sector, I'm a crossover in that sense. Most people you see in the social enterprise space, especially now, are people from corporates who've moved into the development sector. I'm the other one, right? Development sector corporate. So here, one of the things has been that how do you sort of help build capacity? When we start work in our space, a lot of my peers in CSR sustainability space, when they've started projects, probably a lot of these projects in some companies, which here have been dictated for various reasons. Could be board interest, be promoter driven interest, could be, understanding of what is required to, sort of work in that space. And sometimes corporates don't have that time, and sometimes on the social enterprise side, our civil society friends don't always take the time to help, because sometimes this is just about, the corporate will only give money. We do what we know best. We don't need to necessarily them explain challenges, why the things are not happening or why things have gotten delayed. They need to just understand that this is the case. The corporates don't spend the questions or asking the right questions. And this is where, this into a partnership after having done due diligence, things fall apart. Both sides have to understand that there isn't, one has to understand the sector, understand space, the solutions being provided, and give things time. So, I'm sure there are a lot of other things, so I won't, my panelists will be able to give their past perspectives as well. So broadly, these my top of the line thoughts on the trust deficit. As far as COVID, I think what we tried to do here, that while we needed to, we've always looked at highest levels of governance and ensuring that there is a transparency with partners, that they understand what, we understand who they are, especially taking on new partners, what they're trying to do. There used to be a lot, fairly robust due diligence system, looking at sort of not just paper due diligence, physical due diligence as well, which our team, we typically do ourselves. But, during COVID, we realized that if we spent time doing that due diligence, we would really not be responding to the immediate disaster situation, that we had funds that could save lives. I think this was the first time, although we've supported disaster management projects in the past, this disaster that we were all in, this sort of a situation where each one of us, it didn't matter who we were, which part of the country we lived in, it impacted us. I think the immediacy of it, the fact that we needed to respond in the now became very, very clear. And I think, as such, Godrej is in any case a very empathetic organization, but more so during this time. So when our team, we decided that we needed to cut through some of this red tape and make things more streamlined, more agile, so such that we could essentially take a decision to fund an organization based on, references, organizations that we work with on a regular basis and can rely on their references and go with that. That was perfectly fine. We were open to doing that, and that we didn't need to necessarily sign MOUs. So in the first year, in 2020, actually, we did not actually sign any MOUs. We decided to just go with, essentially decide on emails what the scope of the project was, what the deliverables were, what the budgets were, and so on. For the most part, I think our trust was completely...
to step in. I'm wearing my time hats that I promised I'll wear.
Last
minute before we quickly switch around.
Sure. Sorry, I have a minute more?
Yes, a minute.
Okay. Yeah, so essentially, so we cut through a lot of that tape, based it on trust, and I think 9 out of 10 times that trust was borne out. So I'm happy to say it was a very positive response. It's gone a long way internally to also build that sense that social enterprises are not this gray space, that we can work in partnership and with trust and deliver on impact and value. So I'll pause there.
Thanks, Satan, Sagarika. Before I move on to Anupam, it was the right segue, but I think there was a question. Shama, would you like to take the question on trust and trust deficit for just about 2 minutes, and then I shall quickly jump to Anupam.
Sure. I had brought up that trust issue when I was speaking, but I wanted to also bring in the element that Raj was asking about, right? He was talking about why NGOs versus, say, social enterprises. There's a trust deficit with even for-profit. And I think just connecting back to what Sagarika was saying, I do think we have to look at our mental models, right? Somewhere we have this thing that corporate mein paisa theek hai, social enterprises means you're social, so wahan pe paisa nahi hona chahiye. I don't get that divide. But therefore, then social enterprises will figure it out, do it with less. And I really think that is where then, whether it's a quantum of money, whether it's a way of working, that building trust, like Sagarika was saying, and I had mentioned earlier, that relationship building has to happen on a continuous basis. And we need to recognize that relationship, it cannot be, the CSR giving cycle. Well, October to January, we will engage, and then the rest of the year, we won't talk to each other. It doesn't work.
Correct.
Right? And I think the way the world used to work perhaps 20, 30 years ago, where NGOs actually, even today, I think most NGOs are actually educational societies and temple trusts. They're not necessarily innovators. But that aside, I think there was this very stark divide between what was corporate and what was civil society or social impact. And therefore, if you were doing service and work from the heart, there was really no need for money. You could live on thin air and whatever else, right? That reality, I think, has changed, but our mental models have not, right? Which means there is a carryover effect across the board, and that schism or that divide is still not clearly understood, and that continues. So if today Raj is saying social enterprise, what is that? Can you be a for-profit and be doing good? That doesn't make sense anymore for a lot of people. right? And I think that's why we really have to do a lot of myth busting, the professional work that happens, etc. And which is why we're talking about transformation, and I think which is why we're talking about today's session. Over, Bharat.
Thanks a ton, Shama. I think just before I bring in Anupam in, because it's a right segue, this is a point he had made very strongly in our calls. Two things. One is, I think we have a lot of questions in the chat. So panelists, please do keep taking a look, looking at them. And the second one is, in case any of your, for the participants, in case any of you would like to invite people over, it's being streamed on YouTube. So please do share that link for people to watch live as well. We do have, as usual, given that it is a Zoom event and it has been publicized fairly wide and well, we do have Zoom bombers, as they are called. We've witnessed a couple of them already. So please bear with us. We have Indrani and Ramiz doing their best to ensure that we have a good session. And on that note, Anupam, two questions, or rather three questions to bring you in, Anupam, because sure. I think the first one is this false divide or dichotomy that we have developed over a period of time in the idea of a not-for-profit, in the idea of a trust, in the idea of a society, in the idea of a social enterprise and a corporate. You made a very interesting point when we talked last time. If the objective is the same, how do we get there can always be different. What hat we wear can always be different. If our value systems align, we can always get there, was something that you mentioned. So that was the first point, if you could talk about that in terms of the larger trust deficit issue that has been brought up. The second one was a point that Shama had made in terms of when organizations work only within the Indian geography versus when they have a wider approach, because you had mentioned some of the work that you do across as well. What are the challenges that then you're able to see across the board and then able to align them accordingly? Right? Sure. And the third question, very specifically, again, a point that Sagarika brought out as well, the idea of broad brush, all corporates are the same, right? Or all civil society is the same. So then how do you sort of unpack that in your own work on an everyday basis, especially when there's a new person coming into the team, for them to be able to understand this value system that we are talking about? Over to you, Anupam.
Sure, Bharat. First of all, thanks for inviting me for this session. The first thing what I want to talk about, the first question which you asked me is about the dichotomy of purpose and the trust deficit. If I look back at the video that you guys played before this, right, I think the call to action is there. I don't think the social entrepreneur, the NGO, the corporate disagrees on that. But if you saw the plethora of problems that need to be solved, there are a humongous number of problems that you need to work on. So I think the first thing in order to develop trust is actually an alignment of objective. What is the space that you want to play in? And very often a corporate is misbranded as, oh, they're doing this because it serves their business purposes. And that's not always the case. I mean, I don't want to paint every corporate under the same brush, but I can talk very clearly from a DuPont perspective. We have a clear stated objective that we want to touch and improve 100 million lives. Whether we do that through our products, whether we do that through the way we operate our businesses, or whether we do it through the CSR or philanthropy, initiatives that we do undertake. So I think the primary objective needs to be an alignment of objective. Now, the other acquisition which is made very often on the corporate is that why do you want to operate only in a space that you know, or why do you want to operate in a space that you're comfortable with? As Shama rightly pointed out, one of the easiest thing to do is give funding, and you did do it very articulately when she said, CSR activities in this country very often start around the month of October, November, and close before February because that's the financial year ending. I mean, it's not the case. In a lot of cases, a corporate wants to operate in a space where they are comfortable because they bring something to the table beyond money. And to crystallize that, I can talk about two very specific examples. We don't have an agriculture business anymore. It's been divested as a separate company called Corteva, but we used to sell seeds. We used to sell fungicides, insecticides, herbicides in India as one of the business units. But we did a lot of farmer education. And the farmer education was not in the space of fungicides, insecticides, herbicides, and seeds. It was around teaching them on when to harvest, when to sow, providing them information. And I think Mahindra and Mahindra also does a great job of this in terms of farmer education, in terms of weather patterns, whether it's when the monsoons are expected or the rains are expected. So we also talked a lot about soil balance. I mean, if anyone that's in the agricultural space knows, we have 3 NPK elements that need to be in the soil. Unfortunately, because of subsidies, etc., our soil balance in India is probably one of the biggest challenges we face today, with a high concentration of nitrogen, but not the P and the K. So, educating a farmer that you don't use a fertilizer because the fertilizer is a fertilizer or it's cheap, but it's about the right balance that you need to have. So, it's about educating the ecosystem beyond what you do in order to help them make them successful. And again, a lot of these farmers we educated were not the the advanced farmer or the large farmer. It was the small marginal farmer who had about half an hectare or 1 hectare of land. Clearly, he was obviously still a customer to us, but not, if you do your ABC analysis of customers, you'd understand where they lie. So it's really about working in a space that you're comfortable because you have something to add. The second example that I can share of was when during COVID-19, through the American Chamber of Commerce, we were a bunch of American companies that got together and we were asked if we could donate an ICU, a containerized ICU, which can be used for COVID relief and later on move to a rural area where hospitals were not there. So the initial proposal which came to us was a 20-foot container with 3 beds, etc. But when we actually looked, and we were a combination of banks, financial services, engineering companies, and I think, when we looked at the design, what we realized is we could do a 40-foot container and have 5 beds over there, where the cost per bed was actually going to be lower. So it was a more efficient use of funds. It's not only about operating in a space where you want to work, it's about getting the most bang for your buck, not for us as a corporate, but even bang for a buck when we spend it towards a social enterprise. So I think, when an NGO wants to work with a corporate, I think the first thing needs to be an alignment of objective. Are we trying to work towards the same thing? Because honestly, if you are able to establish that early on, I think it usually works flawless. Because if we as a corporate knew what we wanted to do and we knew how to do it, we would never approach you. And likewise, if you'll have the funding and the capabilities, and in some cases, even the know-how, where we can help you upgrade certain things, so those I think are the partnerships that work the best. Moving on to the second question, which you asked us, how does an MNC kind of look at the social space that they want to play in or make an impact in? At DuPont, we have a variety of areas where we want to touch. I'm not going to talk about what we do on the sustainability standpoint. That's a whole topic for another 4 hours, possibly. But, talking about CSR related stuff, we have 3 or 4 broad overarching umbrellas that we want to play in. It's around water, because we know that well. And we know probably future wars may be fought on water at some point in time if we continue to do what we're doing. The second area we talk about is empowerment for women and children. And this comes under the ambit of diversity and inclusion that we have, and empowerment. We obviously do a lot of stuff around safety with, Kevlar, the bulletproof stuff, not only for bulletproof, but also for, tornado houses and so on and so forth. But, we have an overarching umbrella of spaces, and of course, STEM education is another one. So we have a broad umbrella of spaces that we would like to operate in. But the way DuPont operates is they're not mandated on us at a local level. So what we do is we take local level decisions as to where we would like to invest our time, money, and energies on. The one thing, and I think it comes as a function of the organization structure and the authority that the local leadership team is given.
Sorry, Anubhav, I'm wearing my hat again. 1 minute left. Okay.
So it really boils down to the empowerment given to the local site leadership. So what we do at DuPont is we operate in about 7 sites. When I have my corporate funds, whether it is CSR plus more, which we ask for very often, I ask the local leadership, what do you need, or what is it that you want to do in the communities where you operate? So it may not fall within that umbrella. We supported one autistic school in Hyderabad, which clearly doesn't fall in this ambit. So it's really about serving the communities. And then what's left is what we use towards this broader corporate umbrella space. So yeah, I think I kind of touched on, I think, everything you asked me for.
Thanks a lot, Anupam. Generally, the job of a moderator or a sort of somebody who's doing this is very simple. I just have to keep handing over the mic. But in this context, the way that all of you are speaking about and what the questions are coming in, I think Nishit has a very interesting question. In every other transaction, it is about a transaction, a contract that has been signed, and therefore execution of work. But in this context, why do we always end up talking about trust? Why does trust become a central issue, even outside of the CSR scope, is the question that Nishit has asked. Nishit, sorry, I'm paraphrasing, so please chip in with the chat if I have not understood it correctly. I'd like all of you to answer this question. Shama, first you, and then Sagarika, and then Anupam. If all of you can take a couple of minutes to just talk about why does this end up in the realm of trust and the business of trust. Before I move into Anshu, sorry Anshu, but because of this question, I'll just do a quick round robin here and then jump in with you. Shama, all yours.
Okay, I am unmuted. So I think Nishit's question is very interesting. I've been trying to answer it on chat. I don't think that there is a problem if it was a specific kind of transaction, right? So let's say that there is an organization that is feeding thousands of people every day, and there is a corporate which wants to feed 1,000 people every day. They agree to work together. It's a service, you can do this. Right? But not everything in the development sector is that kind of work that you can get into a service contract that's simply, yes, there are levels to it. And I think that is where reducing everything only to a transaction becomes challenging. Right? I would like to believe that if impact is to be achieved, we're going to need to do many things beyond just this funding and contract. Right. And that is where I feel like we are not unlocking the true power of what corporates can bring and what civil society, whether that's nonprofits, innovators, and then the whole range today, right? That, like Sagarika was saying, there's many things in that innovator enterprise space that we can come together. I mentioned there, right? Farmer producer companies doing fantastic work, artisan cooperatives doing fantastic work, but are they able to meet everything that a corporate wants? Perhaps not. Right? And how do we bring those together and bridge that so that we actually have, and to me, this is in the context of accelerating progress on the SDGs. It's not about service delivery. And I think that is where I would look at this and say that there are certain things we can do as services, but not everything is about service. And then therefore going beyond that service delivery requires us to have trust in relationship. I mean, for me, that extends to other stakeholders as well. Today's context is just corporates and innovators. Thank you.
Thanks, Shama. Anupam, over to you before I bring in Sagarika.
Sure. So, I think this is something all of us grapple with, right? And personally, and from a DuPont India perspective, one of the things that we would like to drive is engagement. It's engagement of our employee base with the cause that we're working on, right? And it's been a challenge, and I'm not going to deny that. It's different, and we've seen it work well in certain areas. We've seen work not so well in certain areas. So for a Gurgaon office, we used to work with an organization called Humana, and what that local leadership team was able to do was actually pull in the organization base, and we had a large number of people, about 400 or 500 people there. A large number of them were actually actively engaged in participating beyond what we were doing from a corporate standpoint, right? Because they saw impact being made at these organizations. So I think the first element that needs to be there is that as a corporate sees themselves working with a partner, an NGO or a social entrepreneur, do they really see the value and the impact coming out from the initiatives that are being taken? That automatically goes into, the personal drivers and motivations for any individual, because we don't do this on work time. We do this partially on work time, partially outside of our work time. And the second element, I think, is leadership engagement. I think that becomes very, very important. I think every organization, from my standpoint, needs a senior leader looking at the corporate social initiatives that are being taken by the company. It's not one chart that you put up. Because I think if the leaders walk the talk, the organization follows. So, these are kind of the two things we're trying to inculcate. And, in some places we've not been as successful, to be honest. I mean, there are certain parts of our organization, we operate in about 8 places in India. Some offices we've tried to do many things and we find participation is relatively low. So even when we see success stories within our organization, we're not able to translate them to other parts of the organization. But I think the two elements that I see need to be there in places. One is the organization as individuals needs to see effective work being done that motivates them. And then the second thing is, I think, strong leadership engagement, to walk the talk, so to speak.
Wonderful. Thanks, Anupam. Sagarika, while I think you had some connectivity issues, Nishit had a very interesting question in the chat about in every other transaction, it becomes a contract, it becomes an agreement. But why are we so focused on trust and trust building measures in such a context, especially when the value systems can be aligned? So I was just doing a quick round robin before I bring in Anshu. So it's your turn. Your views on that, please, for 2 minutes before I bring in Anshu.
Sure, thanks, Bharat. I actually noticed, the interaction between Shama and Nishit, and I did think I'd respond to it at some point. Would you ask that question? So I think it's not so much about the initial, the first, say, the round of relationship or the initiation of the relationship. It is about the ongoing nature of the relationship, and that stands true for any sort of relationship, right? I mean, you take a bet on when you first sign up, or as the example Nishit had given, when you buy a product or a service, you take a bet. It is a risk. But whether that is a risk you continue to bet on is defined by trust, right? And it is perhaps in service contracts and so on, or more purely commercial arrangements, perhaps it is implicit, or it develops and it's not really articulated as such. But here in the civil society, or this engagement on larger, and actually it is beyond CSR, as Shama mentioned. And I think some of the examples Anupam also gave in his earlier the comments he made earlier, that there are opportunities beyond just CSR, right? I mean, the ESG space is sort of booming, it's growing in a big way. And there are huge opportunities if only civil society organizations, social enterprises in particular, sit down and map that out. But the ongoing nature of that relationship will be defined by trust.
Great. Thanks a ton, Sagarika. Anshu, I apologize. I'm not sure if the other panelists were being naughty or if the participants were being naughty. I couldn't bring you in before this. I think that's a good segue, the point that Sagarika made, right? About we all take a bet, whether it is getting a new telephone connection, moving to a new city, buying a different brand of rice. We all take a bet. And therefore, what happens post that bet, and what we really mean when we talk about trust in this context. And given the nature of your work and the engagement that you've had with different kinds of corporate entities across the board, if you can talk about a little bit in terms of the nature of challenges that you face, and a point that Anupam and Shama made earlier about value systems having to be aligned. How hard is it to get these value systems to be aligned, right? Is that even feasible? Is that even possible? The floor is yours, Anshu. Again, apologies, 10 minutes.
No problems, Bharat. Thanks. I think I just start with the broader question about respect and empathy. We could make endless amounts of contracts, but till there is respect and empathy between organizations, nothing's going to work. Right. Even, if you have your, an employee, a staff, you have a contract with that staff, but imagine there is no trust between the organization and its employees. Things are not going to work out. So ultimately, it all boils down to respect and empathy for one another. And I think, we've been responsible, all of us and the government, putting these tags on organizations, Section 8s and not-for-profits, social enterprises, for-profits. I think there's just one organization, right? It's a for-purpose organization. All of us who are doing good work with, even if we are earning money in doing that good work and making profits, as long as we're investing it back, as long as we're taking care of our stakeholders, our society. We just need to be categorized as for-purpose organizations. It's sort of, everything gets complicated when you put tags on, tags on people, divide them in religions and countries, and so all these kind of things need to go away. I think the structure needs to be very simple. There are certain organizations, because of whatever reasons, their philosophy, their mission, their values, are doing good work and want to do good work. And there are certain organizations like the not-for-profits or the social enterprises who are the implementing arms. They are the extended arms of these corporates as they create that impact. They're the extended arms of the government as the government seeks to create impact. I think the mistrust happens when some of these actors, such as the government, now the government should be an organization or a body that should have a maximum support for the NGOs. What happened during the COVID time? When the government found itself clueless, NGOs stepped in, corporates stepped in to do essentially the work that government is supposed to do, right? And then, at that time, if you see, there were certain positive vibrations from the government reaching out to NGOs and doing a lot of things. But then after that, all those things that used to happen started again. All compliances, all regulations, and what that has done is created a bad image of the NGOs. And that's where corporates tend to mistrust them. And I'm not talking about all NGOs. Even if there are some NGOs, the perception that gets created, and that leads to mistrust. And that's what happens while, and it's the other way around as well. There's certain corporates who do not do justice to what they're set out to do. And it brings in many more in disrepute. So I think, we need to isolate the issues. Not all corporates are the way we see them. Not all NGOs or social enterprises are how we see them. And I think, alignment of values is something which is the basic stepping stone for anything. And as Anupam has suggested, at the leadership level, there needs to be more interactions. That's where the purpose is built. That's where the vision is drawn. And then things manifest as we go along and, implement it in the field. And that implementation is always going to be much more positive, much more, with much more ownership if there is a top level support. So I think, in terms of challenges, what we have seen is that, one, the CSR space is still very young in the country. And, Bharat has permitted me to say a few controversial things. So, I'll follow his lead. And I don't think we have.
By all means, increase viewership, Anshu. By all means.
Absolutely. Right. So I don't see, while the NGO space in particular, and I will not say social enterprise space because that's still young, but the NGO space is pretty old in the country. But the CSR space is still pretty young. So corporates are also building up their CSR departments. There was a time when HR and admin people used to run CSR. They still do in most organizations. And, those in this room are really from the top-notch corporates. But you just go one level down, you see HR and admin people running CSR. So I think competencies need to be built there. Understanding how the not-for-profit sector works, what are the regulations in the not-for-profit sector, what are some of the challenges that they face need to be understood. I think it also needs to be understood that, now there is a lot of cross-pollination of staff between different kinds of sectors, and the expectations are similar. So if someone going to a big corporate wants to work in a fancy office, someone working in a social enterprise in an NGO also wants that. And there is nothing wrong with that. I think we don't need to be apologetic about it. Either we all decide we're going to have similar offices and workspaces, or we let individuals and our individual organizations decide. And I think, there is this problem of projectitis, that we are funding a project. social organizations, NGOs require much more funding, which is beyond the project. In fact, as the project funding increases in quantum and size, the administration expenses, the overheads increase proportionally. And if you have to build for the future, then requires investment in that. But currently all the funding is all about doing this project, X number of days, X number of beneficiaries. So I think, corporates need to come out of that mode and see their implementation partners, which are their extended hands, as I said, on what they require to build a good future where they could, take these social impact products and services to the end beneficiaries. So I think there requires a slight change in orientation on how you look at the not-for-profit sector. And I think there has to be also a lot of movement between the staff, especially if you're having longer-term engagements with implementation partners. I always believe, why don't people from the social enterprise or NGO space go and work for the CSR department for some time and vice versa, because they'll understand each other's issues, where they're coming from, what their priorities are, how those systems work. And I think there would be a more free flow of best practices and technology and many other things that would require to
2 minutes
build
left. Sorry, 2 minutes left.
Okay, thanks. So to build a successful partnership, and I also really believe, I think, what it really requires is just sitting down together, sitting down with the government and making a strategy for the future. I also agree that there are too many causes. It's very difficult to pick up causes. And that's where it requires a kind of a collaboration for people to come together and decide what are those causes that are most important for a particular geography or our country. I know that UN has the SDGs, but within that there are lots of things as well. So what are some of those important things that we need to focus first on? Because then all our efforts, all our resources would be aligned towards fixing those problems first. Because otherwise, in a country like India, the problems are endless, and no amount of resources can solve the problem. And I think also putting a little bit of onus back on the people, like the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, what can you do for the country? What can you do for this geography? I think it's also involving the society, because we can't treat them always as beneficiaries. It needs to be a relationship of handshake, not a relationship of a give out. So that kind of parity with our beneficiaries also needs to be created. I'll stop there, Bharat. Thanks.
Thank you, Anshu. I think the underlying theme amongst the four of you has been in the age of 140 characters and clickbait. How can we be more nuanced in our conversations? How can we be more nuanced in our understanding of the problem? Before we move on to the next round robin, I'd like to, because two issues or points that all of you brought out very strongly, I'd like all of you to take 2 minutes to sort of just respond to each other on two questions. The first one being around the nature of engagement with leadership teams, as all of you called it, in order to have more sustainable partnerships. What does this engagement with leadership teams really mean? So that was the first question for all of you. The second question was actually, I think, something that Anupam, you mentioned, and Sagarika, you mentioned as well, was leveraging all of our strengths. We'll dive deeper into that later on, but very quickly, if you could use your own experiences to talk about what does leveraging our own strengths to work with somebody else really mean? Anupam, can I start with you, and then Shama, and then Sagarika, and then going back to Anshu?
Sure. But before I respond to questions, I was actually reading the side chat over there, and I think Raj does bring up a point where several NGOs are doing subcontracting work where they don't have experience getting funding from their loyal corporates. I think it's unfair to paint all corporates as that because, I mean, exactly the opposite. And I think I shared that earlier, when we had, not earlier, but when we had a pre-conversation to this, when we dealt with COVID wave 1 in India, we knew we had to do something. And at that point, we didn't know how to navigate or where to go. So we gave our money to these big funding houses. We gave it, to certain organizations, certain governmental organizations. It was simply because we did not know where to go, right? And how to go about this. All of us were dealing with this for the first time. I think Sagarika talked about the alacrity with which Godrej responded and changed a few things in terms of what they wanted to do. But on wave 2, we actually pivoted away from that. There were two things which we did, which were entirely different. The first one was we actually estimated what our budgets were going to be. And we said, let's use 70% of it in the month of April and May, because that was the need of the hour of that point in time. The other thing, seeing how India was going at that time, we actually asked Global to provide us more funds, apart from what we estimated as CSR funds to be, so that we could do more because it was urgent. And we really classified it into 2 or 3 areas. And one was around basically oxygen availability. The other was around safety, because we actually make safety apparel of Tyvek, the PPE and so on and so forth. And the call which we made was that we were going to go hyper-local. We were not going to work with the people we had worked with in the past. And there are some people on the call, actually, in fact, one of our organizations that we worked with did not have some of the paperwork in place. I think we actually went through Swasti and we actually completed that engagement, if I remember correctly. So, I think it's unfair to paint all corporates in that vein. I think that's where it, yes, I mean, I think you need to find the right corporate partner that you need to work with. So rather than, saying I want to work with corporates, find the ones that think like you and then try and engage. Okay, so I just wanted to address side conversation that was going on. Coming back to the nature of engagement with leadership, right? I think one of the first things, and it goes back to the alignment of objective, that's where it needs to start. I know we want to do stuff in the space of water, but what do we do at DuPont? We do wastewater treatments, we do, sewage treatment plants, we do desalination plants. Those are mega million-dollar, hundreds of crores of rupees investments. How do I get clean water into a tap in a local village is something I necessarily don't know how to do. Right. So I think it starts with the objective that both the corporate is looking to play in or to try and help in. And then for the NGO partner to bring its expertise on the table. So I think what would be really beneficial would be for corporates to even have a list of spaces where various NGOs plays and trusted partners. Because yes, we don't know all the small people. We don't know all the small NGOs. There are a lot of small companies that do a lot of good work in corporates, in CSR. You as NGOs don't even know who they are. So that knowledge gap needs to be bridged. This engagement can be, as we talked about earlier, it's not about funding a project. It's about a longer term, engagement. How do we think of the next 5 years that we partner together and do that? Talking about leveraging strengths, I think leveraging strengths can be in two ways, right? One, I talked about the engineering capability and bringing the overall cost of delivery of services, if I may call it, down. But the other leverage is also leveraging, organization structures. If a not-for-profit or an NGO wants to do something in the space where they want a broad reach, corporates have large distribution networks. Corporates have large access to multi-geography markets. You can always leverage those same routes to market, not only for products, but also for social services that you would want to deliver, and vice versa. As I said, I talked about water as a very clear example. I don't know how to go about it. Would we like to do it?
Yeah.
Who can come and tell me, guys, DuPont, this is what we can help you with. This is how we can help you get there. So I think the first thing is understanding and having the alignment of objective of where both of you want to work or what are the objectives you want to achieve. And then really having a more nuanced conversation around, okay, so what are the challenges you as a corporate face? What are the challenges that I face, and then, trying to bridge those together.
Thanks, Anupam. I think Nishit has opened another can of worms in the chat right now. Before we get to those can of worms, Shama, I'd like to ask you to respond to these two questions.
Sure. And I was so intently listening to Anupam. If I digress from the questions you asked, please correct me, right? But I think, and I've said this repeatedly on chat, I think the reality that whether it's Raj or Nishit are talking about is true. India is very, very diverse, and they've had those experiences, so it does happen. So the question really is, can we do things differently? I'm an eternal optimist. I believe it can be done differently. I think civil society working together better, right? We're not competitors, right? We're working together to solve problems. I really think wicked, complex problems is what brings many of us to dedicate our lives to the work that we do, right? So how do we get to understand each other better, and how do we work together better so that organizations can then form those collaboratives? I really believe that collaborative working, if innovators, entrepreneurs, nonprofits, whatever you call them, civil society comes together and is able to form and collaboratively work, understand strengths, we can then demand that corporates also work with us and engage with us in a certain way. I don't think we have sufficient voices engaging, right? It's still that one-to-one or some small groups to small groups, but where is the real space for us to understand each other? Like Anupam was saying, if we were to go to the Catalyst 2030 site, perhaps if you look at WASH, you will today find innovators in WASH. But does that give you enough of an understanding of what they could do? No, somebody has to sit down and take them through that. And who will do that, right? That's where I think all of us will need to say that we take on those roles, right? And I think I've had the privilege of working with many of the organizations that are on this sort of panel in the participants list, because we did come together as collaboratives, right? And unlike Raj, we said, we don't want the money. What do you want to do? You want geography? We'll tell you the geography. You want a cause? We'll match you to the cause. You want to give to a certain kind of entity? We'll find that entity. Right? So depending on what the corporate wants to do, and this is only in funding, I think there are other models to be built. Right. And I think to Sagarika's point that this is beyond CSR and this is beyond funding. We've had partners who worked with us for 7 years. We brought in other organizations to work with them because that is what they were willing to work with us and solve. Right. Now, when a corporate is willing to make that journey of 7 years, 10 years, yes, then we can do a lot of those things. Right. And my role will change. Not everybody perhaps thinks that way, but that is the point, right? I think we have to be willing to take on different roles and say, initially, I started out by implementing a CSR program. 2 years later, they don't want to do something else. Can I introduce them to the best sort of option at that point? Because then this can go on. I don't need to, sort of be the only person doing this. How can we do this more locally? And I think collaboratives are the way to go. I'm really happy that whether as Catalyst 2030, we have the India chapter that's coming together to do this more. And that's the context in which this conversation is happening. But there are more collaborative forums now globally. And if we can align on both sides, I think we can work together better for sure.
Thank you, Shama. Sagarika, before I hand it over to you, Anshu sort of brought out a very interesting point about wearing different hats, moving from one side of the fence, so to speak, to the other side of the fence. And you are best suited to sort of respond to that in this context. Because when it comes to engaging with leadership, you then see the challenges of what that means in both contexts. And especially also in terms of the kind of diverse needs organizations have. So the floor is yours, Sagarika.
Great. Thank you for that. And I think where it comes to sort of, like you said, wearing different hats and also sort of building engagement with leadership, the point, I'll kind of go back to my earlier point about really understanding the sector. And I think one of the things that we've seen work best is really, seeing is believing. So we've ensured that everyone from our board member to our chairperson to our MD to, senior leaders all visit our not perhaps every single project, but they see the larger programs, they get to visit, they meet sort of stakeholders we work with, they understand issues, and stakeholders sometimes ask very difficult questions, and sort of that to us has really helped build understanding about sectors, challenges, and what can we do, and also build commitment. And I think that truly is another area, because once CSR funding needs to be seen as catalytic funding, or funding that can be used to perhaps, depending on the size of the fund, either give proof of concept or to sort of demonstrate at a certain scale, which can then be taken up by the government or larger collaboratives such as Catalyst, in order to make it real for a much, much larger geography than CSR funds will ever be able to impact. So if we see it like that, if we see what we are sort of working towards, that larger, bigger, audacious goal, and we work as partners with our social enterprise partners, then we can make it happen. So that to me is critical. I think you had asked another question about leveraging strengths, and I think I'll give an example of that. I agreed with everything Anupam said. To add one other idea, for example, we Godrej Consumer Products, we sell a variety of products, and our marketing teams excel at trying how do we ensure that brands stick in the consumer's mind, right? Well, we use that expertise to make our behavior change communication, where it comes to preventing mosquito-borne diseases, stickier in the mind of the average citizen. So when our nonprofit partners develop the curriculum, we ensure that the marketing teams also weigh in on it. Sometimes we even get the outsourced partner, the ad agencies, or the creative agencies to weigh in on it, because that really helps ensure that what we put together is really meaningful and valuable, and then we make it available to the larger public. So all the curriculum that we create is available for anyone to freely download and use in any way that they wish to. So that becomes how we add value to programs, and it not just provide funds. Also, I think referring to very quickly to the side chat around, I think Nishit again asked, how can we get corporates to work with social enterprises that maybe make them uncomfortable? It's happening, believe me. Nishit and I'm working with a couple of such projects. I unfortunately can't go into details because we're not at that level of disclosure yet. But what I will say is that it takes patience on both sides. It takes the nonprofit or the social enterprise in this case to realize that no corporate is going to change overnight. And why just corporates? I mean, even us, change doesn't happen overnight, essentially, right? So we need to give it time. We need to be, communicate with respect and empathy on every level, on a daily basis, on a much more regular basis than perhaps we do for, CSR projects. These are more business-driven decisions in the larger ESG space. That's
1 minute, Sagarika. Sorry.
Yeah, that's as much as I can say, but it is happening. And Leave Alone Godrej, I mean, there are organizations that are tied up with everyone, from WWF to Greenpeace and so on. They have corporate partners too. How is that happening? Those are organizations that do make corporates uncomfortable, very uncomfortable. And yet we learn how to work with them, right? So the point is, you have to be willing to come to the table and find a solution. You can't come to the table saying confrontation. That is never going to get us anywhere. So that's there. And then I think you also mentioned about the nexus. Don't look at it as nexus necessarily. I mean, this, I refer back to my point about longer term commitments, because if you have a vision and you have a clearly, and you define a way of working, you find partners you want to work with on a long term basis, because they understand you understand them, and in the process you figure out models that actually work. To me, that's not nexus. That is a partnership that is delivering results. So that's I'll pause there.
Thank you, Sagarika. And Anshu, since you've agreed to be my partner in crime, I shall use you as the provocator since everybody's agreeing with each other. Gets a little boring. So, 2 questions, Anshu. The same 2 questions for everybody, 3 minutes. These are closing comments as well. I think the first one is whenever there is a disaster, there is a collaborative spirit that sets in. I think COVID was a good example of that. But we've seen in India in the past, right? Tsunami being the case, Latur being the case, Bhuj being the case. Every time there is a disaster, people do come together. But then post the disaster, the question that Shama posed very well, right? Sustaining collaborations. It's not about competition. It's about the collaborative nature of achieving the end goal. So how do we do that, and how do we sustain that in today's world in order to get to our end goals? That's the first question. The second question to all of you is, what next? Yes, we are here today. We've talked about a few things. We've talked about breaking down silos. We've talked about changing labels. We've talked about changing perceptions, not painting each other with the same brush. So what's next? I think for this, if all of you can use your own work as an example and give us a few ideas about this, that would be great. Anshu, over to you.
Thanks, Bharat. Yeah, I think, India does things well in a mission mode. We've seen that when, there are clear-cut targets, timelines, and people, energies get together, we are able to solve issues. Recent example is the vaccination drive. I think just a phenomenal effort reaching every nook and corner of the country and making it happen. So I think, in India, that's where it's important to identify which are those priority areas and start on a mission mode. And then as you work towards achieving that mission, and some of these issues would require years or maybe decades of work to be solved. And, then to, have continuity beyond that, you need to leave an ecosystem. And that's where the responsibility of the players are when they are working on this mission mode, on how they could get others involved. How could we make a sustainable model where there are multiple players, multiple stakeholders, so that one organization, even if it goes away, some funding dries out, government attention goes away, there's still that there is continuity for that cause. And I think, that's where one of the comments in the chat about involving other NGOs, smaller NGOs, I essentially feel outsourcing is not a bad thing. As long as, you've ensured that quality is maintained, you've ensured that the same values are exhibited, because, if you talk about outsourcing, they're like manufacturers like Apple, who, are getting everything outsourced, right? So it's not about outsourcing, it's about selecting partners carefully at all levels so that the same values and qualities are maintained. And what you're doing in turn is making people who are capable, having the same values, same capabilities, skills to take that mission forward. And I think, if we approach it that way, we're going to make a big dent approaching it in a mission mode.
Sorry.
Yeah. But at the same time, also leave behind a system in place. In terms of going forward, what's next? I think what's next is more collaboration, more discussions, more interactions with one another, virtual and in person. People need to speak to each other, and that's where this forum provided by Catalyst makes such a huge difference. Getting people from different sectors, different areas of interest, different walks of life together to discuss and debate, because this would translate into more in-person meetings, follow-ups, alignments, partnerships, and that's what's the need of the hour. If we remain in our silos, we'll not move forward. What we need to do is come together, make such partnerships, and we've at Vision Spring very quickly, with our Clear Vision India mission. Or the Bharat Ujjwal Drishti Abhiyan, we want to make all people in India who need a pair of eyeglasses see clearly. And you're partnering with several organizations to make it happen, the government, not-for-profit sector, corporates, hospitals. So I think, approaching this in a collaborative and a partnership sort of way and in a mission mode, according to me, are, the next steps going forward. Thanks, Parag.
Thank you, Anshu. Anupam, the floor is yours.
Sure. So, you talked about sustaining a collaboration, and I can tell you the way it works is it's just, again, I go back to I keep harping on it, but it's around alignment of objective. That's where it starts, because if that's not there, nothing's going to happen. The second thing which we found from our experience, as I talked about our COVID example, right? We pivoted away from the larger organizations to do things on the ground. It was actually a lot more work for us. But I'm proud of the team that worked on it from the DuPont side, because they identified 8-9 partners. Within 1 month, we had the funding out. Now, who are the partners we've sustained collaboration with? Are the ones where we saw a very clear alignment of objective. We saw impact being made on the ground. We saw a lot of, proactive information sharing in terms of what they have done. And, post that, we have not pivoted back to what we've done. In fact, we keep getting ideas from some of these organizations saying, hey, guys, this is what we want to work on. Do you think you can help us? Now, the truth of the matter is we are not an infinite source of resources or funding either. So we have to pick and choose amongst those. But we tend to gravitate back to the people that, or the organizations that we worked with, where it was comfortable to work with each other, because we didn't have the trust, as there's a lot of conversation, you need to have the trust to start, but they established that trust, right? They established the trust. And it's not only that the corporate needs to trust this partner, the NGO needs to trust the corporate too. So it's a two-way street, right? So I think where we found sustained relationships with social entrepreneurs and NGOs that we work is, generally speaking, where we've either found the same language that we speak, same objectives that we pursue, and a similar style of work.
1 minute, sorry.
Yeah. No, and in terms of what next, I think I touched on that earlier. I think what would be great is if there can be, and I think Shama did already guide me in a particular direction where Catalyst 2030 has. But I think, let's not be arrogant enough to say the NGO partner knows everything and the corporate knows everything. Let's find a platform where you can have an open conversation and discuss, hey, or a forum where I can go and say, listen, I need help with this space. Can you help me and guide me as to whom can I go and talk with? And that becomes a more meaningful engagement later on. So I think if you ask me what next, I think that would be the biggest value that we can create for ourselves to try and do what we're trying to do over here.
Great. Thank you, Anupam. Sagarika, the floor is yours. The same 2 questions.
Thank you. I think just starting with the question Nishit made, that Greenpeace doesn't take corporate funding. So I think we have to look beyond just CSR funding. I think Shama mentioned this, Anupam's mentioned this, I've mentioned. Because if we just look at engagement with corporates from the view of funding, then it limits what we can do with those. Change, the kind of change that we are looking to see in the world today can come in a variety of forms. And I think that's where really the next level is. Can be, there can be ways in which social enterprises can become supply chain, part of the supply chain. They can become advisors and consultants. They can, in some ways, this is probably a very, very niche example. For example, we have, gender specialists now on POSH committees of companies. That's just one small way. I mean, they don't even get paid. This is an honorary position, but it's a very critical aspect and very critical role that they provide. So it is a matter of just understanding what these evolving needs are, and I think the ESG space needs to be deconstructed much better by both corporates and by social enterprises. And that's the way forward.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Sagarika. Shama, to close this session, I think I'll add another question to you, because I think Anupam, Sagarika have also brought that in terms of the roles that we play in these partnerships. It is not just about funding and grantees, so to speak. So given the diverse nature of your work as well, Shama, the floor is all yours, 2 minutes. We have our usual mute problems and unmute problems.
So we started with me and unmuting issues, and we're going to sort of wrap up with that. So, again, just to tell a small story, we worked with one corporate and we helped them. And, while I work in public health, and that's what Swasti does, I'm part of a larger set of organizations called the Catalyst Group and part of Catalyst 2030. And so we worked collaboratively for many years, right? So when one of our CSR partners wanted to actually look at their plastic, right, problem, we worked with them to actually help them solve the problem. And I'm not doing it alone, it's a different, but we were ready to engage on something that was out of our space, brought somebody else in, right? They've saved 594 tons of plastic. They have employed about another, I think 20 or 30 community women to help with their plastic sorting. They've met their, sort of plastic related goals, right? And I didn't get funding for the plastic work. So I think, to Sagarika's point, I think there, just like the diversity of social entrepreneurs, innovators, NGOs, there is a diversity of corporates. I think partnership and collaboration is an imperative. There's just no way out of it if we are talking about the SDG goals, right? What we are talking about is not that small incremental change. We need big leaps and transformation completely. Which means we have to really change the way we look at things and do things differently. Echoing what everybody else has said, I think whether in the social space or the corporate space, we must be willing to come together and have those difficult conversations, not only for navigating it for ourselves, but for organizations who are struggling. And we know that, right? I don't know if everyone here knows, but we came together and we did the Now Fund, and we raised 84 lakhs for organizations during COVID. When I say we, it was the Catalyst 2030 network, right? So when there is a network, we are able to identify a need and go solve it. And I think, like Anupam is saying, or others have said this in the past, it's not just due diligence for organizations or the entrepreneurs, NGOs, it's also due diligence for corporates. And I recall a conversation 12 years ago I had with IICA saying, where is my sort of dashboard of corporate, so I can also work with the ones that are already progressive in thinking, but not to leave out the others, right? So I think we need that dialogue, that space coming together, and some will move a little bit more slowly, but I think we know that there are enough people that we can work with, and we start with that to show what is possible, right? I think demonstrating the positive is really, really important. So let's work together. I think more collaboration, more partnership. Thank you.
Thanks, Satan, Shama. Thank you to all four of you. It was wonderful moderating this conversation. I didn't have to do much. All of you led each other to the next question. And I think the underlying theme has been about nuance, right? And I think Nishit, Raj, thank you for the questions in the chat. And I think, Nishit, you are right. There are a lot of challenges that will continue to persist. It is about how do we figure them out together. And I think Anupam Shama stated it very well, that we are eternal optimists. That is why all of us are here today. That is why all of us in the call are here today, right? All 100 of us that started off with the call, we are eternal optimists. That's why we are here today. And I think Anshu Sagarika spoke really about how it is about wearing these different hats, how it is about looking at it from different perspectives. And the spirit of collaboration is not really about doing only X, but leveraging Y's strengths as well. How do we do that together? By breaking down different silos. Just to quickly wrap up, thanks again to everyone for joining in, for listening to us patiently. As is the case with Catalyzing Change Week, everybody is launching a vision document. And I think the call to action that the panelists have already given us is we need to work together. Instead of launching a vision document, we said, why don't we do a call to action, which is about tangible action for us? So we do not have a vision document. What we have instead is a very specific ask from all of you. And on that note, I shall share my screen for the very, very specific ask for all of you. It's a very simple ask, as you can see. How can sort of corporates and non-profits or social enterprises work together? I think all the participants have already stated this, so I shall not spend any time on this slide. It has already been drilled into our heads, right? Break silos, break boundaries. How do we do this? Common objectives. The reason for this is, I think, as Shama very articulately put it and Anupam talked about it, it is about finding out new business models. It is about understanding effective, scalable solutions. The one that Sagarika mentioned as well. What does it mean to be able to use a marketing team effectively in the idea of behavior change communication? So it is about leveraging these skill sets. And I think Anupam, you talked about it. Anshu, you talked about it. What does employee engagement really mean in this context, right? So this is the secret sauce. This is what makes this partnership valuable in the long run and sustainable in the long run. So what we are proposing is a very, very ambitious program. We are saying, come to us in 3 months. You don't need to know ABC. We will teach you to learn the Bhagavad Gita or the Odyssey. You pick, you will do that. That is what we will do within 3 months. We will help you be solution ready in 3 months. We will help you look at systemic change in 3 months and leverage partnerships within 3 months. And how we are doing that is, in the short term, we will give you tangible, actionable tools and frameworks to use. We will talk to you about how do you move beyond these common challenges, how we can sort of build a better understanding between each of us, as all of the panelists have just discussed and people in the chat have just commented. In the midterm, it is about a mentor-mentee relationship, also for many of us to learn from each other's experiences, and a buddy network. I think it's often underestimated, peer network, the value of a peer network, picking up a phone call, hey, I have this problem. This person is not responding to my emails. How do I make them respond to my emails, right? As simple as that. And what does really co-creation and trust mean in the long term? So these are a few things that we hope to accomplish in these 3 months with all of you. How can you do this? If you would like to do this, come join the course. It's a 3-month program. If you have material, if you have programs, examples that can contribute to this, the last month is dedicated to coming up with solutions. So come give us these solutions. We would like everybody to be part of this program. Co-create these solutions. If you have a problem, Anupam, you talked about it. Shama, you talked about it. Sagarika, you mentioned it. You have a problem, put it on the table for this cohort of participants to address this problem. Anshu, you talked about it as well. I think the important thing that we are in the long term planning to do is what we are calling social entrepreneurs in residence. It is not about the hats that you wear. It is not about the for-profit hat. It's not about the non-profit hat. It's about how do we get to solve the problem. So a simple, clear call to action. We do not have a vision document, as I said. There are too many visions being set. So let's just get going and do something about the problem. How can you do something? Here are a few email addresses that you can reach out to sign up to this program. The details of the participants, the details of the panelists. I think the panelists were wonderful. As usual, they let me forego introduction so that we can get to the meat of the substance. So all the details are available online. If you have any questions about this session, please email one of us on the screen, and we shall get back to you as quickly as possible. Once again, thank you. Thanks for joining, everyone. Thank you to the participants. And I think 2 people that we definitely need to thank, or 3 people that we need to thank. Sanyukta for bringing us all together to do this, without whom this wouldn't have happened. Thanks to Ramiz and to Indrani for managing all of this today. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.